This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush. Marquette, Michigan, January 2006. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 11. Arcadian Simplicity. Besides these honest folks at the Hall, whose simplicity and sweet rural purity surely show the advantage of a country life over a town one, we must introduce the reader to their relatives and neighbors at the rectory, Bute Crawley and his wife. The Reverend Bute Crawley was a tall, stately, jolly, shovel-hatted man, far more popular in this country than the baronet, his brother. At college he pulled a stroke oar in the Christ Church boat, and had thrashed all the best bruisers of the town. He carried his taste for boxing and athletic exercise into private life. There was not a fight within 20 miles at which he was not present, nor a race, nor a coursing match, nor a regatta, nor a ball, nor an election, nor a visitation dinner, nor indeed a good dinner in the whole country, but he found means to attend it. You might see his bay mare and gig lamps a score of miles away from the rectory house, whenever there was any dinner party at Fuddleston, or at Roxby, or at Wapeshot Hall, or at the great lords of the country, with all of whom he was intimate. He had a fine voice, sang a southerly wind in a cloudy sky, and gave the whoop in chorus with general applause. He rode to hounds in a pepper and salt frock, and was one of the best fishermen in the country. Mrs. Crawley, the rector's wife, was a smart little body who wrote this worthy divine's sermons. Being of a domestic turn, and keeping the house a great deal with her daughters, she ruled absolutely within the rectory, wisely giving her husband full liberty without. He was welcome to come and go, and dine abroad as many days as his fancy dictated, for Mrs. Crawley was a saving woman, and knew the price of port wine. Ever since Mrs. Bute carried off the young rector of Queen's Crawley, she was of a good family, daughter of the late Lieutenant Colonel Hector McTavish, and she and her mother played for Bute and won him at Harrogate. She had been a prudent and thrifty wife to him. In spite of her care, however, he was always in debt. It took him at least 10 years to pay off his college bills, contracted during his father's lifetime. In the late 1790-something, when he was just clear of these encumbrances, he gave the odds of 100 to 1 in 20s against Kangaroo, who won the Derby. The rector was obliged to take up the money as a ruinous interest, and had been struggling ever since. His sister helped him with 100 now and then, but of course his great hope was in her death, when, hang it, as he would say, Matilda must leave me half her money. So that the baronet and his brother had every reason which two brothers possibly can have for being by the ears. Sir Pitt had had the better of Bute in innumerable family transactions. Young Pitt not only did not hunt, but set up a meeting-house under his uncle's very nose. Rawdon, it was known, was to come in for the bulk of Miss Crawley's property. These money transactions, these speculations in life and death, these silent battles for reversionary spoil, make brothers very loving towards each other in Vanity Fair. I, for my part, have known a 5-pound note to interpose and knock up a half-century's attachment between two brethren, and can't but admire, as I think, what a fine and durable thing love is among worldly people. It cannot be supposed that the arrival of such a personage as Rebecca at Queen's Crawley, and her gradual establishment in the good graces of all people there, could be unremarked by Mrs. Bute Crawley. Mrs. Bute, who knew how many days the sirloin of beef lasted at the Hall, how much linen was got ready at the Great Wash, how many peaches were on the south wall, how many doses her ladyship took when she was ill, for such points are matters of intense interest to certain persons in the country. Mrs. Bute, I say, could not pass over the hall governess without making every inquiry respecting her history and character. There was always the best understanding between the servants at the rectory and the hall. There was always a good glass of ale in the kitchen of the former place for the hall people, whose ordinary drink was very small, and indeed the rector's lady knew exactly how much malt went to every barrel of hall beer. Ties of relationship existed between the hall and rectory domestics, as between their masters, and through these channels each family was perfectly well acquainted with the doings of the other. That, by the way, may be set down as a general remark. When you and your brother are friends, his doings are indifferent to you. When you have quarrelled, all his outgoings and incomings you know, as if you were his spy. Very soon then after her arrival, Rebecca began to take a regular place in Mrs. Crawley's bulletin from the hall. It was to this effect: the black porkers killed, weighed X stone, salted the sides, pig's pudding and leg of pork for dinner. Mr. Cramp from Mudbury over with Mr. Pitt about putting John Blackmore in goal. Mr. Pitt at meeting, with all the names of the people who attended. My lady as usual, the young ladies with the governess. Then the report would come, the new governess be a rare manager, Sir Pitt be very sweet on her, Mr. Crawley too, he be reading tracts to her. What an abandoned wench, said little, eager, active, black-faced Mrs. Bute Crawley. Finally the reports were that the governess had come round. Everybody wrote Sir Pitt's letters, did his business, managed his accounts, had the upper hand of the whole house, my lady, Mr. Crawley, the girls and all, at which Mrs. Crawley declared she was an artful hussy, and had some dreadful designs in view. Thus the doings at the hall were the great food for conversation at the rectory, and Mrs. Bute's bright eyes spied out everything that took place in the enemy's camp, everything and a great deal besides. Mrs. Bute Crawley to Miss Pinkerton, The Mall, Chiswick. Rectory, Queen's Crawley, December something. My dear Madam, although it is so many years since I profited by your delightful and invaluable instructions, yet I have ever retained the fondest and most reverential regard for Miss Pinkerton and dear Chiswick. I hope your health is good. The world and the cause of education cannot afford to lose Miss Pinkerton for many, many years. When my friend Lady Fuddleston mentioned that her dear girls required an instructress, I am too poor to engage a governess for mine, but was I not educated at Chiswick? Who, I exclaimed, can we consult but the excellent, the incomparable Miss Pinkerton? In a word, have you, dear madam, any ladies on your list whose services might be made available to my kind friend and neighbour? I assure you she will take no governess but of your choosing. My dear husband is pleased to say that he likes everything which comes from Miss Pinkerton's school. How I wish I could present him and my beloved girls to the friend of my youth, and the admired of the great lexicographer of our country. If you ever travel into Hampshire, Mr. Crawley begs me to say he hopes you will adorn our rural rectory with your presence. 'Tis the humble but happy home of your affectionate Martha Crawley. P.S. Mr. Crawley's brother, the baronet, with whom we are not, alas, upon those terms of unity in which it becomes brethren to dwell, has a governess for his little girls, who, I am told, had the good fortune to be educated at Chiswick. I hear various reports of her, and as I have the tenderest interest in my dearest little nieces, whom I wish, in spite of family differences, to see among my own children, and as I long to be attentive to any pupil of yours, do, my dear Miss Pinkerton, tell me the history of this young lady, whom, for your sake, I am most anxious to befriend. M.C. Miss Pinkerton to Mrs. Bute Crawley. Johnson House, Chiswick, December 18 something. Dear Madam, I have the honor to acknowledge your polite communication, to which I promptly reply. 'Tis most gratifying to one in my most arduous position to find that my maternal cares have elicited a responsive affection, and to recognize in the amiable Mrs. Bute Crawley, my excellent pupil of former years, the sprightly and accomplished Miss Martha McTavish. I am happy to have under my charge now the daughters of many of those who were your contemporaries at my establishment. What pleasure it would give me if your own beloved young ladies had need of my instructive superintendence. Presenting my respectful compliments to Lady Buttleston, I have the honor, epistolarily, to introduce to her ladyship my two friends, Miss Tuffin and Miss Hawkey. Either of these young ladies is perfectly qualified to instruct in Greek, Latin, and the rudiments of Hebrew, in mathematics and history, in Spanish, French, Italian, and geography, in music, vocal and instrumental, in dancing without the aid of a master, and in the elements of natural sciences. In the use of the globes both are proficients. In addition to these, Miss Tuffin, who is daughter of the late Reverend Thomas Tuffin, Fellow of Corpus College, Cambridge, can instruct in the Syriac language and the elements of constitutional law. But as she is only 18 years of age and of exceedingly pleasing personal appearance, perhaps this young lady may be objectionable in Sir Huddleston Fuddleston's family. Miss Letitia Hawkey, on the other hand, is not personally well favored. She is 29, her face is much pitted with the smallpox, and has a halt in her gait, red hair, and a trifling obliquity of vision. Both ladies are endowed with every moral and religious virtue. Their terms, of course, are such as their accomplishments merit. With my most grateful respects to the Reverend Bute Crawley, I have the honor to be, dear madam, your most faithful and obedient servant, Barbara Pinkerton. P.S. The Miss Sharp whom you mention as governess to Sir Pitt Crawley, Bart. M.P., was a pupil of mine, and I have nothing to say in her disfavor. Though her appearance is disagreeable, we cannot control the operations of nature, and though her parents were disreputable, her father being a painter, several times bankrupt, and her mother, as I have since learned with horror, a dancer at the opera, yet her talents are considerable, and I cannot regret that I received her out of charity. My dread is lest the principles of the mother, who was represented to me as a French countess, forced to emigrate in the late revolutionary horrors, but who, as I have since found, was a person of the very lowest order and morals, should at any time prove to be hereditary in the unhappy young woman whom I took as an outcast. But her principles have hitherto been correct, I believe, and I am sure nothing will occur to injure them in the elegant and refined circle of the eminent Sir Pitt Crawley. Miss Rebecca Sharp to Miss Amelia Sedley. I have not written to my beloved Amelia for these many weeks past, for what news was there to tell of the sayings and doings at Humdrum Hall, as I have christened it? And what do you care whether the turnip crop is good or bad, whether the fat pig weighed 13 stone or 14, and whether the beasts thrive well upon mangel-wurzel? Every day since I last wrote has been like its neighbour. Before breakfast, a walk with Sir Pitt and his stud; after breakfast studies, such as they are, in the schoolroom; after schoolroom, reading and writing about lawyers, leases, coal mines, canals, with Sir Pitt, whose secretary I am become; after dinner, Mr. Crawley's discourses on the baronet's backgammon, during both of which amusements my lady looks on with equal placidity. She has become rather more interesting by being ailing of late, which has brought a new visitor to the hall, in the person of a young doctor. Well, my dear, young women need never despair. The young doctor gave a certain friend of yours to understand that, if she chose to be Mrs. Glauber, she was welcome to ornament the surgery. I told his impudence that the gilt pestle and mortar was quite ornament enough, as if I was born, indeed, to be a country surgeon's wife. Mr. Glauber went home seriously indisposed at his rebuff, took a cooling draught, and is now quite cured. Sir Pitt applauded my resolution highly. He would be sorry to lose his little secretary, I think, and I believe the old wretch likes me as much as it is in his nature to like anyone. Marry, indeed! And with a country apothecary, after— No, one cannot so soon forget old associations, about which I will talk no more. Let us return to Humdrum Hall. For some time past it is Humdrum Hall no longer. My dear Miss Crawley has arrived with her fat horses, fat servants, fat spaniel, and great rich Miss Crawley, with 70,000 pounds in the 5 per cents, whom, or I had better say which, her 2 brothers adore. She looks very apoplectic, and, dear soul, no wonder her brothers are anxious about her. You should see them struggling to settle her cushions, or to hand her coffee. "When I come into the country," she says, for she has a great deal of humor, "I leave my toady, Miss Biggs, at home. My brothers are my toadies here, my dear, and a pretty pair they are." When she comes into the country our hall is thrown open, and for a month at least you would fancy old Sir Walpole has come to life again. We have dinner parties and drive out in the coach and four. The footmen put on their newest canary-colored liveries. We drink claret and champagne as if we were accustomed to it every day. We have wax candles in the schoolroom, and fires to warm ourselves with. Lady Crawley is made to put on the brightest pea green in her wardrobe, and my pupils leave off their thick shoes and tight old tartan pelisses, and wear silk stockings and muslin frocks, as fashionable baronets' daughters should. Rose came in yesterday in a sad plight. The Wiltshire sow, an enormous pet of hers, ran her down, and destroyed a most lovely flowered lilac silk dress by dancing over it. Had this happened a week ago, Sir Pitt would have sworn frightfully, have boxed the poor wretch's ears, and put her upon bread and water for a month. All he said was, "I'll serve you out, miss, when your aunt's gone," and laughed off the accident as quite trivial. Let us hope his wrath will have passed away before Miss Crawley's departure. I hope so, for Miss Rose's sake, I am sure. What a charming reconciler and peacemaker money is! Another admirable effect of Miss Crawley and her 70,000 pounds is to be seen in the conduct of the 2 brothers Crawley. I mean the baronet and the rector, not our brothers, but the former, who hate each other all the year round, become quite loving at Christmas. I wrote to you last year how the abominable horse-racing rector was in the habit of preaching clumsy sermons at us at church, and how Sir Pitt snored in answer. When Miss Crawley arrives, there is no such thing as quarrelling heard of. The hall visits the rectory, and vice versa. The parson and the baronet talk about the pigs and the poachers and the country business in the most affable manner, and without quarrelling in their cups. I believe, indeed, Miss Crawley won't hear of their quarrelling, and vows that she will leave her money to the Shropshire Crawleys if they offend her. If they were clever people, those Shropshire Crawleys, they might have it all, I think. But the Shropshire Crawley is a clergyman like his Hampshire cousin, and mortally offended Miss Crawley, who had fled thither in a fit of rage against her impracticable brethren, by some straight-laced notions of morality. He would have prayers in the house, I believe. Our sermon books are shut up when Miss Crawley arrives, and Mr. Pitt, whom she abominates, finds it convenient to go to town. On the other hand, the young dandy, Blood, I believe is the term, Captain Crawley, makes his appearance, and I suppose you will like to know what sort of person he is. Well, he is a very large young dandy. He is 6 feet high, and speaks with a great voice, and swears a great deal, and orders about the servants, who all adore him nevertheless, for he is very generous of his money, and the domestics will do anything for him. Last week the keepers almost killed a bailiff and his man, who came down from London to arrest the captain, who were found lurking about the park wall. They beat them, ducked them, and were going to shoot them for poachers, but the baronet interfered. The captain has a hearty contempt for his father, I can see, and calls him an old put, an old snob, an old chawbacon, and numberless other pretty names. He has a dreadful reputation among the ladies. He brings his hunters home with him, lives with the squires of the country, asks whom he pleases to dinner, and Sir Pitt dares not say no, for fear of offending Miss Crawley, and missing his legacy when she dies of her apoplexy. Shall I tell you a compliment the captain paid me? I must, it is so pretty. One evening we actually had a dance. There was Sir Huddleston Fuddleston and his family, Sir Giles Wapshot and his young ladies, and I don't know how many more. Well, I heard him say, "By Jove, she's a neat little filly," meaning your humble servant, and he did me the honor to dance 2 country dances with me. He gets on pretty gaily with the young squires, with whom he drinks, bets, rides, and talks about hunting and shooting. But he says the country girls are bores. Indeed, I don't think he is far wrong. You should see the contempt with which they look down on poor me. When they dance I sit and play the piano very demurely, but the other night, coming in rather flushed from the dining-room, and seeing me employed in this way, he swore out loud that I was the best dancer in the room, and took a great oath that he would have the fiddlers from Mudbury. "I'll go and play a country dance," said Mrs. Bute Crawley, very readily. She is a little black-faced old woman in a turban, rather crooked, and with very twinkling eyes. And after the captain and your poor little Rebecca had performed a dance together, do you know she actually did me the honor to compliment me upon my steps? Such a thing was never heard of before. And proud Mrs. Bute Crawley, first cousin to the Earl of Tiptoff, who won't condescend to visit Lady Crawley, except when her sister is at the country. Poor Lady Crawley! During most part of these gaieties she is upstairs taking pills. Mrs. Bute had all of a sudden taken a great fancy to me. "My dear Miss Sharp," she says, "why not bring over your girls to the rectory? Their cousins will be so happy to see them." I know what she means. Signor Clementi did not teach us the piano for nothing, at which price Mrs. Bute hopes to get a professor for her children. I can see through her schemes, as though she told them to me. But I shall go, as I am determined to make myself agreeable. Is it not a poor governess's duty, who has not a friend or protector in the world? The rector's wife paid me a score of compliments about the progress my pupils made, and thought, no doubt, to touch my heart, poor, simple country soul, as if I cared a fig about my pupils. Your India muslin and your pink silk, dearest Amelia, are said to become me very well. They are a good deal worn now, but you know we poor girls can't afford de fraîche toilette. Happy, happy you, who have but to drive to St. James Street, and a dear mother who will give you anything you ask. Farewell, dearest girl. Your affectionate Rebecca. P.S. I wish you could have seen the faces of the Miss Blackbrooks, Admiral Blackbrook's daughters, my dear, fine young ladies with dresses from London, when Captain Rawdon selected poor me for a partner. When Mrs. Bute Crawley, whose artifices our ingenious Rebecca had so soon discovered, had procured from Miss Sharp the promise of a visit, she induced the all-powerful Miss Crawley to make the necessary application to Sir Pitt, and the good-natured old lady, who loved to be gay herself, and to see everyone gay and happy round about her, was quite charmed and ready to establish a reconciliation and intimacy between her 2 brothers. It was therefore agreed that the young people of both families should visit each other frequently for the future, and the friendship of course lasted as long as the jovial old mediatrix was there to keep the peace. "Why did you ask that scoundrel Rawdon Crawley to dine?" said the rector to his lady, as they were walking home through the park. "I don't want the fellow. He looks down upon us country people as so many blackamoors. He is never content unless he gets my yellow-sealed wine, which costs me 10 shillings a bottle, hang him. Besides, he's such an infernal character. He's a gambler, he's a drunkard, he's a profligate in every way. He shot a man in a duel. He's over head and ears in debt, and he's robbed me and mine of the best part of Miss Crawley's fortune. Waxy says she has him—" Here the rector shook his head at the moon, with something very like an oath, and added in a melancholious tone, "down in her will for 50,000, and there won't be above 30 to divide." "I think she's going," said the rector's wife. "She was very red in the face when we left dinner. I was obliged to unlace her." "She drank 7 glasses of champagne," said the reverend gentleman in a low voice, "and filthy champagne it is, too, that my brother poisons us with, but you women never know what's what." "We know nothing," said Mrs. Bute Crawley. "She drank cherry brandy after dinner," continued his reverence, "and took curaçao with her coffee. I wouldn't take a glass for a 5-pound note. It kills me with heartburn. She can't stand it, Miss Crawley. She must go. Flesh and blood won't bear it, and I lay 5 to 2 Matilda drops in a year." Indulging in these solemn speculations, and thinking about his debts, and his son Jim at college, and Frank at Woolwich, and the 4 girls, who were no beauties, poor things, and would not have a penny but what they got from the aunt's expected legacy, the rector and his lady walked on for a while. "Pitt can't be such an infernal villain as to sell the reversion of the living, and that Methodist milksop of an eldest son looks to Parliament," continued Mr. Crawley after a pause. "Sir Pitt Crawley will do anything," said the rector's wife. "We must get Miss Crawley to make him promise it to James." "Pitt will promise anything," replied the brother. "He promised he'd pay my college bills when my father died. He promised he'd build the new wing to the rectory. He promised he'd let me have Gibbs Field and the 6-acre meadow, and much he executed his promises. And it's to his man's son, this scoundrel, gambler, swindler, murderer of a Rawdon Crawley, that Matilda leaves the bulk of her money. I say it's unchristian. By Jove, it is. The infamous dog has got every vice except hypocrisy, and that belongs to his brother." "Hush, my dear, we're in Sir Pitt's grounds," interposed his wife. "I say he has got every vice, Mrs. Crawley. Don't ma'am bully me. Didn't he shoot Captain Marker? Didn't he rob young Lord Dovedale at the Cocoa Tree? Didn't he cross the fight between Bill Soames and the Cheshire Trump, by which I lost 40 pound? You know he did. And as for the women, why, you heard that before me in my own magistrate's room." "For heaven's sake, Mr. Crawley," said the lady, "spare me the details." "And you ask this villain into your house," continued the exasperated rector. "You, the mother of a young family, the wife of a clergyman of the Church of England. By Jove!" "Bute Crawley, you are a fool," said the rector's wife scornfully. "Well, ma'am, fool or not, and I don't say, Martha, I'm so clever as you are, I never did, but I won't meet Rawdon Crawley, that's flat. I'll go over to Huddleston, that I will, and see his black greyhound, Mrs. Crawley, and I'll run Lancelot against him for 50, by Jove I will, or against any dog in England, but I won't meet that beast Rawdon Crawley." "Mr. Crawley, you are intoxicated as usual," replied his wife, and the next morning, when the rector woke and called for small beer, she put him in mind of his promise to visit Sir Huddleston Fuddleston on Saturday. And as he knew he should have a wet night, it was agreed that he might gallop back again in time for church on Sunday morning. Thus it will be seen that the parishioners of Crawley were equally happy in their squire and in their rector. Miss Crawley had not long been established at the Hall before Rebecca's fascinations had won the heart of that good-natured London rake, as they had of the country innocents whom we have been describing. Taking her accustomed drive one day, she thought fit to order that little governess should accompany her to Mudbury. Before they had returned, Rebecca had made a conquest of her, having made her laugh 4 times, and amused her during the whole of the little journey. "Not let Miss Sharp dine at table," said she to Sir Pitt, who had arranged a dinner of ceremony and asked all the neighbouring baronets. My dear creature, do you suppose I can talk about the nursery with Lady Fuddleston, or discuss justice's business with that goose, old Sir Giles Wapshot? I insist upon Miss Sharp appearing. Let Lady Crawley remain upstairs if there is no room. But little Miss Sharp, why, she's the only person fit to talk to in the country." Of course, after such a peremptory order as this, Miss Sharp, the governess, received commands to dine with the illustrious company below stairs; and when Sir Huddleston had, with great pomp and ceremony, handed Miss Crawley in to dinner, and was preparing to take her place by her side, the old lady cried out in a shrill voice, "Becky Sharp, Miss Sharp, come up and sit by me and amuse me, and let Sir Huddleston sit by Lady Wapshot." When the parties were over and the carriages had rolled away, the insatiable Miss Crawley would say, "Come to my dressing-room, Becky, and let me abuse the company," which between them this pair of friends did perfectly. Old Sir Huddleston wheezed a great deal at dinner. Sir Giles Wapshot had a particularly noisy manner of imbibing his soup, and her ladyship a wink of the left eye, all of which Becky caricatured to admiration, as well as the particulars of the night's conversation, the politics, the war, the quarter sessions, the famous run with the H.H., and those heavy and dreary themes about which country gentlemen converse. As for the Misses Wapshot's toilets and Lady Fuddleston's famous yellow hat, Miss Sharp tore them to tatters, to the infinite amusement of her audience. "My dear, you are a perfect trouvaille," Miss Crawley would say. "I wish you could come to me in London, but I can't make a butt of you as I do of poor Briggs. No, no, you little sly creature, you are too clever. Isn't she, Firkin?" Mrs. Firkin, who was dressing the very small remnant of hair which remained on Miss Crawley's pate, flung up her head and said, "I think Miss is very clever," with the most killing sarcastic air. In fact, Mrs. Firkin had that natural jealousy which is one of the main principles of every honest woman. After rebuffing Sir Huddleston Fuddleston, Miss Crawley ordered that Rawdon Crawley should lead her in to dinner every day, and that Becky should follow her with cushion, or else she would have Becky's arm and Rawdon with the pillow. "We must sit together," she said. "We're the only 3 Christians in the country, my love." In which case it must be confessed that religion was at a very low ebb in the country of Hants. Besides being such a fine religionist, Miss Crawley was, as we have said, an ultra-liberal in opinions, and always took occasion to express these in the most candid manner. "What is birth, my dear?" she would say to Rebecca. "Look at my brother Pitt. Look at the Huddlestons, who have been here since Henry II. Look at poor Bute at the parsonage. Is any one of them equal to you in intelligence or breeding? Equal to you? They are not even equal to poor dear Briggs, my companion, or Bowles, my butler. You, my love, are a little paragon, positively a little jewel. You have more brains than half the shire. If merit had its reward, you ought to be a duchess. No, there ought to be no duchesses at all. But you ought to have no superior, and I consider you, my love, as my equal in every respect. And will you put some coals on the fire, my dear? And will you pick this dress of mine and alter it, you who can do it so well?" So this old philanthropist used to make her equal run of her errands, execute her millinery, and read her to sleep with French novels every night. At this time, as some old readers may recollect, the genteel world had been thrown into a considerable state of excitement by 2 events, which, as the papers say, might give employment to the gentleman of the long robe. Ensign Shafton had run away with Lady Barbara Fitzurse, the Earl of Bruin's daughter and heiress; and poor Vere Vane, a gentleman who, up to 40, had maintained a most respectable character, and reared a numerous family, suddenly and outrageously left his home for the sake of Mrs. Rogemont, the actress, who was 65 years of age. "That was the most beautiful part of dear Lord Nelson's character," Miss Crawley said. "He went to the deuce for a woman. There must be good in a man who will do that. I adore all impudent matches. What I like best is for a nobleman to marry a miller's daughter, as Lord Flowerdale did. It makes all the women so angry. I wish some great man would run away with you, my dear. I'm sure you're pretty enough." "Two postboys! Oh, it would be delightful," Rebecca owned. "And what I like next best is for a poor fellow to run away with a rich girl. I have set my heart on Rawdon running away with someone." "A rich someone or a poor someone?" "Why, you goose, Rawdon has not a shilling but what I give him. He is criable to debts. He must repair his fortune and succeed in the world." "Is he very clever?" Rebecca asked. "Clever, my love? Not an idea in the world beyond his horses and his regiment, and his hunting and his play. But he must succeed. He's so delightfully wicked. Don't you know he has hit a man and shot an injured father through the hat only? He's adored in his regiment, and all the young men at Wadier's and the Coca-Tree swear by him." When Miss Rebecca Sharp wrote to her beloved friend the account of the little ball at Queen's Crawley, and the manner in which, for the first time, Captain Crawley had distinguished her, she did not, strange to relate, give an altogether accurate account of the transaction. The captain had distinguished her a great number of times before. The captain had met her in a half-score of walks. The captain had lighted upon her in a half-hundred of corridors and passages. The captain had hung over her piano 20 times of an evening. My lady was now upstairs, being ill, and nobody heeded her, as Miss Sharp sang. The captain had written her notes, the best that the great blundering dragoon could devise and spell, but dualness gets on as well as any other quality with women. But when he put the first of the notes into the leaves of the song she was singing, the little governess, rising and looking him steadily in the face, took up the triangular missive daintily, and waved it about as if it were a cocked hat, and she, advancing to the enemy, popped the note into the fire, and made him a very low curtsy, and went back to her place, and began to sing away again more merrily than ever. "What's that?" said Miss Crawley, interrupted in her after-dinner doze by the stoppage of the music. "It's a false note," Miss Sharp said with a laugh, and Rawdon Crawley fumed with rage and mortification. Seeing the evident partiality of Miss Crawley for the new governess, how good it was of Mrs. Bute Crawley not to be jealous, and to welcome the young lady to the rectory, and not only her, but Rawdon Crawley, her husband's rival in the old maid's 5 per cents. They became very fond of each other's society, Mrs. Crawley and her nephew. He gave up hunting, he declined entertainment at Fuddleston, he would not dine with the mess of the depot at Mudbury. His great pleasure was to stroll over to Crawley Parsonage, whither Miss Crawley came too, and as their mamma was ill, why not the children with Miss Sharp? So the children, little dears, came with Miss Sharp, and of an evening some of the party would walk back together. Not Miss Crawley, she preferred her carriage. But to the walk over the rectory fields, and in at the little park wicket, and through the dark plantation, and up the checkered avenue to Queen's Crawley, was charming in the moonlight to two such lovers of the picturesque as the captain and Miss Rebecca. "Oh, those stars, Miss Rebecca would say, turning her twinkling green eyes up towards them. "I feel myself almost a spirit when I gaze upon them." "Oh, God, yes, so do I exactly, Miss Sharp," the other enthusiast replied. "You don't mind my cigar, do you, Miss Sharp?" Miss Sharp loved the smell of a cigar out of doors, beyond everything in the world, and she just tasted one too, in the prettiest way possible, and gave a little puff, and a little scream, and a little giggle, and restored the delicacy to the captain, who twirled his mustache, and straightway puffed it into a blaze that glowed quite red in the dark plantation, and swore, "Jove, God, it's the finest cigar I ever smoked in the world, for his intellect and conversation were alike brilliant and becoming to a heavy young dragoon. Old Mr. Pitt, who was taking his pipe and beer, and talking to John Horrocks about a ship that was to be killed, espied the pair so occupied from his study window, and with dreadful oaths swore that if it wasn't for Miss Crawley, he'd take Rawdon and Bundle'n out of doors, like a rogue as he was. "He be a bad un, sure enough," Mr. Horrocks replied, "and his man Fleathers is wuss, and have made such a row in the housekeeper's room about the dinners and hale, as no lord could make. But I think Miss Sharp's a match for him, Sir Pitt," he added after a pause. And so, in truth, she was, for father and son, too. End of chapter 11.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush. Marquette, Michigan, June 2006. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 12. Quite a sentimental chapter. We must now take leave of Arcadia and those amiable people practising the rural virtues there, and travel back to London to inquire what has become of Miss Amelia. "We don't care a fig for her," writes some unknown correspondent with a pretty little handwriting and a pink seal to her note. "She is fade and insipid," and adds some more kind remarks in this strain, which I should never have repeated at all, but that they are in truth prodigiously complimentary to the young lady whom they concern. Has the beloved reader, in his experience of society, never heard similar remarks by good-natured female friends, who always wonder what you can see in Miss Smith that is so fascinating, or what could induce Major Jones to propose for that silly, insignificant, simpering Miss Thompson, who has nothing but her wax-doll face to recommend her? What is there in a pair of pink cheeks and blue eyes forsooth? These dear moralists ask, and hint wisely that the gifts of genius, the accomplishments of the mind, the mastery of Mangle's questions, and a ladylike knowledge of botany and geology, the knack of making poetry, the power of rattling sonatas in the Hers manner, and so forth, are far more valuable endowments for a female than those fugitive charms which a few years will inevitably tarnish. It is quite edifying to hear women speculate upon the worthlessness and the duration of beauty. But though virtue is a much finer thing, and those hapless creatures who suffer under the misfortune of good looks ought to be continually put in mind of the fate which awaits them, and though very likely the heroic female character which ladies admire is a more glorious and beautiful object than the kind, fresh smiling, artless, tender little domestic goddess whom men are inclined to worship, yet the latter and inferior sort of women must have this consolation, that the men do admire them after all, and that, in spite of all our kind friends' warnings and protests, we go on in our desperate error and folly, and shall to the end of the chapter. Indeed, for my own part, though I have been repeatedly told by persons for whom I have the greatest respect, that Miss Brown is an insignificant chit, and Mrs. White has nothing but her petite minois chiffon, and Mrs. Black has not a word to say for herself. Yet I know that I have had the most delightful conversations with Mrs. Black. Of course, my dear madam, they are inviolable. I see all the men in a cluster round Mrs. White's chair, all the young fellows battling to dance with Miss Brown, and so I am tempted to think that to be despised by her sex is a very great compliment to a woman. The young ladies in Amelia's society did this for her very satisfactorily. For instance, there was scarcely any point upon which the Misses Osborne, George's sisters, and the Mademoiselle Dobin agreed so well as in their estimate of her very trifling merits, and their wonder that their brothers could find any charms in her. "We are kind to her," the Misses Osborne said, a pair of fine, black-browed young ladies, who had had the best of governesses, masters, and milliners, and they treated her with such extreme kindness and condescension, and patronized her so insufferably, that the poor little thing was in fact perfectly dumb in their presence, and to all outward appearance as stupid as they thought her. She made efforts to like them, as in duty bound, and as sisters of her future husband. She passed long mornings with them, the most dreary and serious of forenoons. She drove out solemnly in their great family coach with them, and Miss Wirt their governess, that raw-boned Vestal. They took her to the ancient concerts by way of a treat, and to the oratorio, and to St. Paul's to see the charity children, where, in such terror was she of her friends, she almost did not dare be affected by the hymn the children sang. Their house was comfortable, their papa's table rich and handsome, their society solemn and genteel, their self-respect prodigious. They had the best pew at the Foundling. All their habits were pompous and orderly, and all their amusements intolerably dull and decorous. After every one of her visits, and oh how glad she was when they were over, Miss Osborne, and Miss Maria Osborne, and Miss Wirt, the Vestal governess, asked each other with increased wonder, "What could George find in that creature?" "How is this?" some carping reader exclaims. "How is it that Amelia, who had such a number of friends at school, and was so beloved there, comes out into the world and is spurned by her discriminating sex?" My dear sir, there were no men at Miss Pinkerton's establishment except the old dancing master, and you would not have had the girls fall out with him. When George, their handsome brother, ran off directly after breakfast, and dined from home half a dozen days a week, no wonder the neglected sisters felt a little vexation. When young Bullock, of the firm of Hulker, Bullock and Company, bankers, Lombard Street, who had been making up to Miss Maria the last 2 seasons, actually asked Amelia to dance the cotillion, could you expect that the former young lady should be pleased? And yet she said she was, like an artless, forgiving creature. "I'm so delighted you like dear Amelia," she said quite eagerly to Mr. Bullock, after the dance. "She's engaged to my brother George. There's not much in her, but she's the best natured and most unaffected young creature. At home we're all fond of her." Dear girl! Who can calculate the depth of affection expressed in that enthusiastic so? Miss Wirt and these 2 affectionate young women so earnestly and frequently impressed upon George Osborne's mind the enormity of the sacrifice he was making, and his romantic generosity in throwing himself away upon Amelia, that I'm not sure but that he really thought he was one of the most deserving characters in the British army, and gave himself up to be loved with a good deal of easy resignation. Somehow, although he left home every morning, as was stated, and dined abroad 6 days in the week, when his sisters believed the infatuated youth to be at Miss Sedley's apron-strings, he was not always with Amelia, whilst the world supposed him at her feet. Certain it is that, on more occasions than one, when Captain Dobbin called to look for his friend, Miss Osborne, who was very attentive to the captain, and anxious to hear his military stories, and to know about the health of his dear mamma, would laughingly point to the opposite side of the square and say, "Oh, you must go to the Sedleys to ask for George. We never see him from morning till night." At which kind of speech the captain would laugh in rather an absurd, constrained manner, and turn off the conversation, like a consummate man of the world, to some topic of general interest, such as the opera, the Prince's last ball at Carlton House, or the weather, that blessing to society. "What an innocent it is, that pet of yours," Miss Maria would then say to Miss Jane, upon the captain's departure. "Did you see how he blushed at the mention of poor George on duty?" "It's a pity Frederick Bullock hasn't some of his modesty, Maria," replies the elder sister with a toss of her head. Modesty! Awkwardness, you mean, Jane. I don't want Frederick to trample a hole in my muslin frock, as Captain Dobbin did in yours at Mrs. Perkins's. "In your frock! Hee hee! How could he, Wasn't he dancing with Amelia? The fact is, when Captain Dobbin blushed so and looked so awkward, he remembered a circumstance of which he did not think it was necessary to inform the young ladies, viz., that he had been calling at Mr. Sedley's house already, on the pretence of seeing George, of course, and George wasn't there, only poor little Amelia, with rather a sad wistful face, seated near the drawing-room window, who, after some very trifling stupid talk, ventured to ask, was there any truth in the report that the regiment was soon to be ordered abroad? And had Captain Dobbin seen Mr. Osborne that day? The regiment was not ordered abroad as yet, and Captain Dobbin had not seen George. "He was with his sister, most likely," the captain said. "Should he go and fetch the truant?" So she gave him her hand kindly and gratefully, and he crossed the square, and she waited and waited. But George never came. Poor little tender heart! And so it goes on, hoping and beating and longing and trusting. You see, it is not much of a life to describe. There is not much of what you call incident in it. Only one feeling all day. When will he come? Only one thought to sleep and wake upon. I believe George was playing billiards with Captain Cannon in Swallow Street at the time when Amelia was asking Captain Dobbin about him, for George was a jolly sociable fellow and excellent in all games of skill. Once, after 3 days of absence, Miss Amelia put on her bonnet and actually invaded the Osborne house. "What? Leave our brother to come to us?" said the young ladies. "Have you had a quarrel, Amelia? Do tell us." No, indeed, there had been no quarrel. "Who could quarrel with him?" says she, with her eyes filled with tears. She only came over to see her dear friends. They had not met for so long. And this day she was so perfectly stupid and awkward that the Misses Osborne and their governess, who stared after her as she went sadly away, wondered more than ever what George could see in poor little Amelia. Of course they did. How was she to bear that timid little heart for the inspection of those young ladies with their bold black eyes? It was best that it should shrink and hide itself. I know the Misses Osborne were excellent critics of a cashmere shawl or a pink satin slip, and when Miss Turner had hers dyed purple and made into a spencer, and when Miss Pickford had her ermine tippet twisted into a muff and trimmings, I warrant you the changes did not escape the 2 intelligent young women before mentioned. But there are things, look you, of a finer texture than fur or satin, and all Solomon's glories, and all the wardrobe of the Queen of Sheba, things whereof the beauty escapes the eyes of many connoisseurs. And there are sweet modest little souls on which you light, fragrant and blooming, tenderly, in quiet shady places. And there are garden ornaments, as big as brass warming pans, that are fit to stare the sun itself out of countenance. Miss Sedley was not of the sunflower sort, and I say it is out of the rules of all proportion to draw a violet of the size of a double dahlia. No, indeed, the life of a good young girl who is in the parental nest as yet can't have many of those thrilling incidents to which the heroine of romance commonly lays claim. Snares or shot may take off the old birds foraging without. Hawks may be abroad, from which they escape or by whom they suffer. But the young ones in the nest have a pretty comfortable unromantic sort of existence in the down and the straw, till it comes to their turn, too, to get on the wing. While Becky Sharp was on her own wing in the country, hopping on all sorts of twigs, and amid a multiplicity of traps, and pecking up her food quite harmless and successful, Amelia lay snug in her home of Russell Square. If she went into the world, it was under the guidance of the elders, nor did it seem that any evil could befall her, or that opulent, cheery, comfortable home in which she was affectionately sheltered. Mamma had her morning duties, and her daily drive, and the delightful round of visits and shopping which forms the amusement, or the profession, as they may call it, of the rich London lady. Papa conducted his mysterious operations in the city, a stirring place in those days, when war was raging all over Europe, and empires were being staked, when the Courier newspaper had tens of thousands of subscribers, when one day brought you a battle of Vittoria, another a burning of Moscow, or a newsman's horn blowing down Russell Square about dinner time announced such a fact as "Battle of Leipzig, 600,000 men engaged, total defeat of the French, 200,000 killed." Old Sedley once or twice came home with a very grave face, and no wonder, when such news as this was agitating all the hearts and all the stocks of Europe. Meanwhile matters went on in Russell Square, Bloomsbury, just as if matters in Europe were not in the least disorganized. The retreat from Leipzig made no difference in the number of meals Mr. Sambo took in the servants' hall. The Allies poured into France, and the dinner bell rang at 5 o'clock just as usual. I don't think poor Amelia cared anything about Brienne and Montmirail, or was fairly interested in the war until the abdication of the Emperor, when she clapped her hands and said prayers. Oh, how grateful! And flung herself into George Osborne's arms with all her soul, to the astonishment of everybody who witnessed that ebullition of sentiment. The fact is, peace was declared. Europe was going to be at rest. The Corsican was overthrown, and Lieutenant Osborne's regiment would not be ordered on service. That was the way in which Miss Amelia reasoned. The fate of Europe was Lieutenant George Osborne to her. His dangers being over, she sang Te Deum. He was her Europe, her emperor, her allied monarchs and august prince regent. He was her sun and moon, and I believe she thought the grand illumination and ball at the Mansion House, given to the sovereigns, were especially in honour of George Osborne. We have talked of shift, self, and poverty as those dismal instructors under whom poor Miss Becky Sharp got her education. Now love was Miss Amelia Sedley's last tutoress, and it was amazing what progress our young lady made under that popular teacher. In the course of 15 or 18 months, daily and constant attention to this eminent finishing governess, what a deal of secrets Amelia learned, which Miss Wirt and the black-eyed young ladies over the way, which old Miss Pinkerton of Chiswick herself, had no cognizance of. As, indeed, how should any of those prim and reputable virgins? With Mrs. P. and W., the tender passion is out of the question. I would not dare to breathe such an idea regarding them. Miss Maria Osborne, it is true, was attached to Mr. Frederick Augustus Bullock, of the firm of Hulker, Bullock and Bullock, but hers was a most respectable attachment, and she would have taken Bullock senior just the same, her mind being fixed, as that of a well-bred young woman should be, upon a house in Park Lane, a country house at Wimbledon, a handsome chariot, and 2 prodigious tall horses and footmen, and 1/4 of the annual profits of the eminent firm of Hulker and Bullock, all of which advantages were represented in the person of Frederick Augustus. Had orange blossoms been invented then, those touching emblems of female purity imported by us from France, where people's daughters are universally sold in marriage, Miss Maria, I say, would have assumed the spotless wreath, and stepped into the travelling carriage by the side of gouty old, bald-headed, bottle-nosed Bullock senior, and devoted her beautiful existence to his happiness with perfect modesty, only the old gentleman was married already. So she bestowed her young affections on the junior partner. Sweet blooming orange flowers! The other day I saw Miss Trotter, that was, arrayed in them, trip into the travelling carriage at St. George's, Hanover Square, and Lord Methuselah hobbled in after. With what an engaging modesty she pulled down the blinds of the chariot! The dear innocent! There were half the carriages of Vanity Fair at the wedding. This was not the sort of love that finished Amelia's education, and in the course of a year turned a good young girl into a good young woman, to be a good wife presently, when the happy time should come. This young person, perhaps it was very imprudent in her parents to encourage her and abet her in such idolatry and silly romantic ideas, loved, with all her heart, the young officer in His Majesty's service with whom we have made a brief acquaintance. She thought about him the very first moment on waking, and his was the very last name mentioned in her prayers. She never had seen a man so beautiful or so clever, such a figure on horseback, such a dancer, such a hero in general. Talk of the Prince's bow! What was it to George's? She had seen Mr. Brummel, who everybody praised so. Compare such a person as that to her George! Not amongst all the beaux at the opera, and there were beaux in those days with actual opera hats, was there any one to equal him. He was only good enough to be a fairy prince, and oh, what magnanimity to stoop to such a humble Cinderella! Miss Pinkerton would have tried to check this blind devotion very likely, had she been Amelia's confidante, but not with much success, depend upon it. It is in the nature and instinct of some women. Some are made to scheme, and some to love, and I wish any respected bachelor that reads this may take the sort that best likes him. While under this overpowering impression, Miss Amelia neglected her 12 dear friends at Chiswick most cruelly, as such selfish people commonly will do. She had but this subject, of course, to think about, and Miss Saltire was too cold for a confidante, and she couldn't bring her mind to tell Miss Swartz, the woolly-haired young heiress from St. Kitts. She had little Laura Martin home for the holidays, and my belief is, she made a confidante of her, and promised that Laura should come and live with her when she was married, and gave Laura a great deal of information regarding the passion of love, which must have been singularly useful and novel to that little person. Alas, alas! I fear poor Emmy had not a well-regulated mind. What were her parents doing not to keep this little heart from beating so fast? Old Sedley did not seem much to notice matters. He was graver of late, and his city affairs absorbed him. Mrs. Sedley was of so easy and uninquisitive a nature that she wasn't even jealous. Mr. Joss was away, being besieged by an Irish widow at Cheltenham. Amelia had the house to herself. Ah, too much to herself sometimes. Not that she ever doubted, for, to be sure, George must be at the Horse Guards, and he can't always get leave from Chatham, and he must see his friends and sisters, and mingle in society when in town. He, such an ornament to every society, and when he is with the regiment he is too tired to write long letters. I know where she kept that packet she had, and can steal in and out of her chamber like Iachimo. Like Iachimo? No, that is a bad part. I will only act moonshine, and peep harmless into the bed where faith and beauty and innocence lie dreaming. But if Osborne's were short and soldier-like letters, it must be confessed that were Miss Sedley's letters to Mr. Osborne to be published, we should have to extend this novel to such a multiplicity of volumes as not the most sentimental reader could support. That she not only filled sheets of large paper, but crossed them with the most astonishing perverseness. That she wrote whole pages out of poetry books without the least pity. That she underlined words and passages with quite a frantic emphasis, and in fine gave the usual tokens of her condition. She wasn't a heroine. Her letters were full of repetition. She wrote rather doubtful grammar sometimes, and in her verses took all sorts of liberties with the metre. But oh, mesdames, if you are not allowed to touch the heart sometimes in spite of syntax, and are not to be loved until you all know the difference between trimeter and tetrameter, may all poetry go to the deuce, and every schoolmaster perish miserably. End of chapter 12.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's reading by Daniel Harris. Vanity Fair by William Thackeray. Chapter 13. Sentimental and Otherwise. I fear the gentleman to whom Miss Amelia's letters were addressed was rather an obdurate critic. Such a number of notes followed Lieutenant Osborne about the country that he almost became ashamed of the jokes of his mess-room companions regarding them, and ordered his servant never to deliver them except at his private apartment. He was seen lighting his cigar with one, to the horror of Captain Dobbin, who it is my belief would have given a banknote for the document. For some time George strove to keep the liaison a secret. There was a woman in the case. That he admitted. "Not the first either," said Ensign Spooney to Ensign Stubble. "That Osborne's a devil of a fellow. There was a judge's daughter at Demeria went almost mad about him. Then there was that beautiful quadroon girl, Miss Pye, at St. Vincent's, you know. And since he's been home they say he's a regular Don Giovanni, by Jove." Stubble and Spooney thought that to be a regular Don Giovanni, by Jove, was one of the finest qualities a man could possess. And Osborne's reputation was prodigious among the young men of the regiment. He was famous in field sports, famous at a song, famous on parade, free with his money, which was bountifully supplied by his father. His coats were better made than any man's in the regiment, and he had more of them. He was adored by the men. He could drink more than any officer of the whole mess, including old Heavytop, the colonel. He could spar better than Knuckles, the private, who would have been a corporal but for his drunkenness, and who had been in the prize ring, and was the best batter and bowler out and out of the regimental club. He rode his own horse, Greased Lightning, and won the Garrison Cup at Quebec races. There were other people besides Amelia who worshipped him. Stubble and Spooney thought him a sort of Apollo. Dobbin took him to be an admirable Crichton, and Mrs. Major O'Dowd acknowledged he was an elegant young fellow, and put her in mind of Fitzgerald Fogarty, Lord Castlefogarty's second son. Well, Stubble and Spooney and the rest indulged in the most romantic conjectures regarding this female correspondent of Osborne's, opining that it was a duchess in London who was in love with him, or that it was a general's daughter who was engaged to somebody else and madly attached to him, or there was a member of Parliament's lady who proposed 4 horses and an elopement, or that I was some other victim of a passion delightfully exciting, romantic, and disgraceful to all parties, on none of which conjectures would Osborne throw the least light, leaving his young admirers and friends to invent and arrange their whole history. And the real state of the case would never have been known at all in the regiment but for Captain Dobbin's indiscretion. The captain was eating his breakfast one day in the mess-room, while Cackle, the assistant surgeon, and the 2 above-named worthies were speculating upon Osborne's intrigue, Stubble holding out that the lady was the Duchess about Queen Charlotte's court, and Cackle vowing that she was an opera singer of the worst reputation. At this idea Dobbin became so moved that though his mouth was full of eggs and bread and butter at the time, and though he ought not to have spoken at all, yet he couldn't help blurting out, "Cackle, you're a stupid fool. You are always talking nonsense and scandal. Osborne is not going to run off with a duchess or ruin a milliner. Miss Studley is one of the most charming young women that ever lived. He's been engaged to her for ever so long, and the man who calls her names had better not do so in my hearing." With which, turning exceedingly red, Dobbin ceased speaking and almost choked himself with a cup of tea. The story was over the regiment in half an hour, and that very evening Mrs. Major O'Dowd rode off to her sister Glorvina at O'Downston not to hurry from Dublin, young Osborne being prematurely engaged already. She complimented the lieutenant in an appropriate speech over a glass of whisky toddy that evening, and he went home perfectly furious to quarrel with Dobbin, who had declined Mrs. Major O'Dowd's party, and sat in his own room playing the flute and, I believe, writing poetry in a very melancholy manner, to quarrel with Dobbin for betraying his secret. "Who the deuce asked you to talk about my affairs?" Osborne shouted indignantly. "Why the devil is all the regiment to know that I am going to be married? Why is that telling old harridan, Piggy O'Dowd, to make free with my name at her D supper table, and advertise my engagement over the 3 kingdoms? After all, what right have you to say I am engaged, or to meddle in my business at all, Dobbin? Seems to me, Captain Dobbin began. Seems to be hanged, Dobbin, his junior interrupted him. I am under obligations to you. I know it a D deal too well, too. But I won't always be sermonized by you because you're 5 years my senior. I'm hanged if I'll stand for your airs of superiority and infernal pity and patronage. Pity and patronage! I should like to know in what I'm your inferior? Are you engaged? Captain Dobbin interposed. What the devil's that to you or any other here if I am? Are you ashamed of it? Dobbin resumed. What right have you to ask me that question, sir? I should like to know, George said. Good God, you don't mean to say you want to break off? Asked Dobbin, starting up. In other words, you ask me if I'm a man of honor, said Osborne fiercely. Is that what you mean? You've adopted such a tone regarding me lately that if I'll bear it any more. What have I done? I've told you you were neglecting a sweet girl, George. I've told you that when you go to town you ought to go to her, and not the gambling houses about St. James. You want your money back, I suppose, said George with a sneer. Of course I do. I always did, didn't I? Says Dobbin. You speak like a generous fellow. No, hang it, William. I beg your pardon. Here George interposed in a fit of remorse. You have been my friend in 100 ways, heaven knows. You've got me out of a score of scrapes. When Crawley of the Guards won that sum of money off me, I should have been done but for you. I know I should. You shouldn't deal so hardly with me. You shouldn't be always catechizing me. I am very fond of Amelia. I adore her, and that sort of thing. Don't look angry. She's faultless. I know she is. You see, there's no fun in winning a thing unless you play for it. Hang it, the regiment's just back from the West Indies. I must have a little fling, and then when I'm married, I'll reform. I will upon my honor now. And I say, Dob, don't be angry with me, and I'll give you 100 next month, when I know my father will stand something handsome, and I'll ask Heavy Top for leave, and I'll go to town and see Amelia tomorrow. There now, will that satisfy you? It's impossible to be long angry with you, George, said the good-natured captain. And as for the money, old boy, you know if I wanted it, you'd share your last shilling with me. That I would, by Jove, Dobbin, George said with the greatest generosity, though by the way he never had any money to spare. Only I wish you had sown those wild oats of yours, George. If you could have seen poor little Miss Emmy's face when she asked me about you the other day, you'd have pitched those billiard balls to the deuce. Go and comfort her, you rascal. Go and write her a long letter. Do something to make her happy. A very little will. I believe she's D fond of me, the lieutenant said, with a self-satisfied air, and went off to finish the evening with some jolly fellows in the mess room. Amelia, meanwhile, in Russell Square, was looking at the moon, which was shining upon that peaceful spot, as well as upon the square of the Chatham Barracks, where Lieutenant Osborne was quartered, and thinking to herself how her hero was employed. Perhaps he is visiting the sentries, thought she. Perhaps he is bivouacking. Perhaps he is attending the couch of some wounded comrade, or studying the art of war up in his own desolate chamber. And her kind thoughts sped away as if they were angels and had wings, and flying down the river to Chatham and Rochester, strove to peep into the barracks where George was. All things considered, I think it was well the gates were shut, and the sentry allowed no one to pass, so that the poor little white-robed angel could not hear the songs those young fellows were roaring over the whiskey punch. The day after the little conversation at Chatham Barracks, young Osborne, to show that he would be as good as his word, prepared to go to town, thereby incurring Captain Dobbin's applause. I should have liked to make her a little present, Osborne said to his friend in confidence, only I am quite out of cash until my father tips up. But Dobbin would not allow his good nature and generosity to be balked, and so accommodated Mr. Osborne with a few pound notes, which the latter took after a little faint scruple. I dare say he would have bought something very handsome for Amelia, only, getting off the coach in Fleet Street, he was attracted by a handsome shirt-pin in a jeweller's window, which he could not resist, and having paid for that, had very little money to spare for indulging in any further exercise of kindness. Never mind. You may be sure it was not his presence Amelia wanted. When he came to Russell Square, her face lighted up as if he had been sunshine. The little cares, fears, tears, timid misgivings, sleepless fancies of I don't know how many days and nights were forgotten under one moment's influence of that familiar, irresistible smile. He beamed on her from the drawing-room door, magnificent, with ambrosial whiskers, like a god. Sambo, whose face, as he announced Captain Osborne, having conferred a brevet rank on that young officer, blazed with a sympathetic grin, saw the little girl start and flush and jump up from her watching place in the window, and Sambo retreated, and as soon as the door was shut she went on fluttering to Lieutenant George Osborne's heart as if it was the only natural home for her to nestle in. "O thou poor panting little soul! The very finest tree in the whole forest, with the straightest stem and the strongest arms, and the thickest foliage, wherein you choose to build and coo, may be marked, for what you know, and may be down with a crash ere long. What an old, old simile that is between man and timber." In the meanwhile, George kissed her very kindly on her forehead and glistening eyes, and was very gracious and good, and she thought his diamond chirpin, which she had not known him to wear before, the prettiest ornament ever seen. The observant reader, who has marked our young lieutenant's previous behaviour, and has presented our report of the brief conversation which he has just had with Captain Dobbin, has possibly come to certain conclusions regarding the character of Mr. Osborne. Some cynical Frenchman has said that there are two parties to a love transaction, the one who loves, and the other who condescends to be so treated. Perhaps the love is occasionally on the man's side, perhaps on the lady's. Perhaps some infatuated swain has erred of this mistaken insensibility for modesty, dullness for maiden reserve, mere vacuity for sweet bashfulness, and a goose, in a word, for a swan. Perhaps some beloved female subscriber has arrayed an ass in the splendor and glory of her imagination, admired his dullness as manly simplicity, worshipped his selfishness as manly superiority, treated his stupidity as majestic gravity, and used him as the brilliant fairy Titania did a certain weaver at Athens. I think I have seen such comedies of errors going on in the world. But this is certain, that Amelia believed her lover to be one of the most gallant and brilliant men in the empire, and it is possible Lieutenant Osborne thought so too. He was a little wild. How many young men are, and don't girls like a rake better than a milksop? He hadn't sown his wild oats as yet, but he would soon, and quit the army now that peace was proclaimed. The Corsican monster locked up at Elba, promotion by consequence over, and no chance left for the display of his undoubted military talents and valor, and his allowance, with Amelia's settlement, would enable them to take a snug place in the country somewhere, in a good sporting neighbourhood, and he would hunt a little, and farm a little, and they would be very happy. As for remaining in the army as a married man, that was impossible. Fancy Mrs. George Osborne in lodgings in a country town, or, worse still, in the East or West Indies, with a society of officers, and patronized by Mrs. Major O'Dowd. Amelia died with laughing at Osborne's stories about Mrs. Major O'Dowd. He loved her much too fondly to subject her to that horrid woman and her vulgarities, and the rough treatment of a soldier's life. He didn't care for himself, not he, but his dear little girl should take the place in society to which, as his wife, she was entitled, and to these proposals you may be sure she acceded, as she would to any other from the same author. Holding this kind of conversation, and building numberless castles in the air, which Amelia adored with all sorts of flower gardens, rustic walks, country churches, Sunday schools, and the like, while George had his mind's eye directed to the stables, the kennel, and the cellar, this young pair passed away a couple of hours very pleasantly, and as the lieutenant had only that single day in town, and a great deal of most important business to transact, it was proposed that Miss Emmy should dine with her future sisters-in-law. This invitation was accepted joyfully. He conducted her to his sister's, where he left her talking and prattling in a way that astonished those ladies, who thought that George might make something of her, and he then went off to transact his business. In a word, he went out and ate ices at a pastry-cook's shop in Charing Cross, tried a new coat in Pall Mall, dropped in at the Old Slaughters, and called for Captain Cannon, played 11 games of billiards with the captain, of which he won 8, and returned to Russell Square half an hour late for dinner, but in very good humour. It was not so with old Mr. Osborne. When that gentleman came from the city and was welcomed in the drawing-room by his daughters and the elegant Miss Wirt, they saw at once by his face, which was puffy, solemn, and yellow at the best of times, and by the scowl and twitching of his black eyebrows, that the heart within his large white waistcoat was disturbed and uneasy. When Amelia stepped forward to salute him, which he always did with great trembling and timidity, he gave a surly grunt of recognition, and dropped the little hand out of his great hirsute paw without any attempt to hold it there. He looked around gloomily at his eldest daughter, who, comprehending the meaning of his look, which asked unmistakably, "Why the devil is she here?" said at once, "George is in town, papa, and has gone to the Horse Guards and will be back to dinner." "Oh, he is he? I won't have dinner kept waiting for him, Jane." With which this worthy man lapsed into his particular chair, and then the utter silence in his genteel, well-furnished drawing-room was only interrupted by the alarm ticking of the great French clock. When that chronometer, which was surmounted by a cheerful grass group of the sacrifice of Iphigenia, told 5 in a heavy cathedral tone, Mr. Osborne pulled the bell at his right hand violently, and the butler rushed up. "Dinner!" roared Mr. Osborne. "Mr. George isn't come in, sir," interposed the man. "Damn Mr. George, sir. Am I master of the house?" "Dinner!" Mr. Osborne scowled. Amelia trembled. Telegraphic communication of eyes passed between the other 3 ladies. The obedient bell in the lower regions began ringing the announcement of the meal. The tolling over, the head of the family thrust his hands into the great tail pockets of his great blue coat with brass buttons, without waiting for a further announcement strode downstairs alone, scowling over his shoulder at the 4 females. "What's the matter now, my dear?" asked one of the other as they rose and tripped gingerly behind the sire. "I suppose the funds are failing," whispered Miss Wirt, and so, trembling and in silence, this hushed female company followed their dark leader. They took their places in silence. He growled out a blessing, which sounded as gruffly as a curse. The great silver dish covers were removed. Amelia trembled in her place, for she was next to the awful Osborne, and alone on her side of the table, the gap being occasioned by the absence of George. "Soup!" says Mr. Osborne, clutching the ladle, fixing his eyes on her in a sepulchral tone, and having helped her and the rest, did not speak for a while. "Take Miss Sedley's plate away," at last he said. "She can't eat the soup. No more can I. It's beastly. Take away the soup, Hicks, and tomorrow turn the cook out of the house, Jane." Having concluded his observations upon the soup, Mr. Osborne made a few curt remarks respecting the fish, also of a savage and satirical tendency, and cursed Billingsgate with an emphasis quite worthy of the place. Then he lapsed into silence, and swallowed sundry glasses of wine, looking more and more terrible, till a brisk knock at the door told of George's arrival, when everybody began to rally. He could not come before. General Deguillet had kept him waiting at the Horse Guards. Never mind Superfish. Give him anything. He didn't care what. Capital mutton. Capital everything. His good humour contrasted with his father's severity, and he rattled on unceasingly during dinner, to the delight of all, of one especially, who need not be mentioned. As soon as the young ladies had discussed the orange and the glass of wine which formed the ordinary conclusion of the dismal banquets in Mr. Osborne's house, the signal to make sail for the drawing-room was given, and they all arose and departed. Amelia hoped George would soon join them there. She began playing some of his favourite waltzes, then newly imported, at the great carved-legged, leather-cased grand piano in the drawing-room overhead. This little artifice did not bring him. He was deaf to the waltzes. They grew fainter and fainter. The discomfited performer left the huge instrument presently, and though her 3 friends performed some of the loudest and most brilliant new pieces of their repertoire, she did not hear a single note, but sat thinking and boding evil. Old Osborne's scowl, terrific always, had never looked before so deadly to her. His eyes followed her out of the room, as if she had been guilty of something. When they brought her coffee, she started as though it were a cup of poison which Mr. Hicks, the butler, wished to propose to her. What mystery was there lurking? Oh, these women! They nurse and cuddle their presentiments, and make darlings of their ugliest thoughts, as they do of their deformed children. The gloom on the paternal countenance had also impressed George Osborne with anxiety. With such eyebrows, and a look so decidedly bilious, how was he to extract that money from the governor, of which George was consumedly in want? He began praising his father's wine. That was generally a successful means of cajoling the old gentleman. "We never got such Madeira in the West Indies, sir, as yours. Colonel Heavytop took off 3 bottles of that you sent me down under his belt the other day." "Did he?" said the old gentleman. "Stands me in 8 shillings a bottle." "Will you take 6 guineas a dozen for it, sir?" said George with a laugh. "There's one of the greatest men in the kingdom wants some." "Does he?" growled the senior. "Wish he may get it." "When General Daguilet was at Chatham, sir, Heavytop gave him a breakfast and asked me for some of the wine. The general liked it just as well, wanted a pipe for the commander-in-chief. He's His Royal Highness's right-hand man." "It is devilish fine wine," said the eyebrows, and they looked more good-humoured, and George was going to take advantage of this complacency and bring the supply question on the mahogany, when the father, relapsing into solemnity, though rather cordial in manner, bade him ring the bell for the claret. "And we'll see if that's as good as the Madeira, George, to which His Royal Highness is welcome, I'm sure. And as we are drinking it, I'll talk to you about a matter of importance." Amelia heard the claret bell ringing as she sat nervously upstairs. She thought, somehow, it was a mysterious and presentimental bell. Of the presentiments which some people are always having, some surely must come right. "What I want to know, George," the old gentleman said, after slowly smacking his first bumper, "what I want to know is how you and that little thing upstairs are carrying on." "I think, sir, it is not hard to see," George said with a self-satisfied grin. "Pretty clear, sir. What capital wine!" "What do you mean, pretty clear, sir?" "Why, hang it, sir, don't push me too hard. I'm a modest man. I don't set up to be a lady killer, but I do own that she's as devilish fond of me as she can be. Anyone can see that with half an eye." "And you yourself?" "Why, sir, didn't you order me to marry her? And ain't I a good boy? Haven't our papas settled it ever so long?" "A pretty boy indeed. Haven't I heard of your doings, sir, with Lord Tarkin, Captain Crawley of the Guards, the Honourable Mr. Ducasse, and all that set? Have a care, sir, have a care." The old gentleman pronounced these aristocratic names with the greatest gusto. Whenever he met a great man he grovelled before him, and my lorded him as only a free-born Briton can do. He came home and looked out his history in the peerage. He introduced his name into his daily conversation. He bragged about his lordship to his daughters. He fell down prostrate and basked in him as a Neapolitan beggar does in the sun. George was alarmed when he heard the names. He feared his father might have been informed of certain transactions at play. But the old moralist eased him by saying serenely, "Well, well, young men will be young men. And the comfort to me is, George, that living in the best society in England, as I hope you do, as I think you do, as my means will allow you to do—" "Thank you, sir," says George, making his point at once. "One can't live with these great folks for nothing. And my purse, sir, look at it." And he held up a little token which had been netted by Amelia, and contained the very last of Dobbin's pound notes. "You shan't want, sir. The British merchant's son shan't want, sir. My guineas are as good as theirs, George, my boy, and I don't grudge 'em. Call on Mr. Chopper as you go through the city tomorrow. He'll have something for you. I don't grudge money when I know you're in good society, because I know that good society can never go wrong. There's no pride in me. I was a humbly born man. You have had advantages. Make a good use of them. Mix with the young nobility. There's many of them who can't spend $1 to your guinea, my boy. And as for the pink bonnets—" Here from under the heavy eyebrows there came a knowing and a not very pleasing leer. "Why, boys will be boys. Only there's one thing I order you to avoid, which, if you do not, I'll cut you off with a shilling, by Jove, and that's gambling." "Oh, of course, sir," said George. But to return to the other business about Amelia. Why shouldn't you marry higher than a stockbroker's daughter, George? That's what I want to know. It's a family business, sir, says George, cracking filberts. You and Mr. Sedley made the match 100 years ago. I don't deny it, but people's positions alter, sir. I don't deny that Sedley made my fortune, or rather put me in the way of acquiring, by my own talents and genius, that proud position, which I may say I occupied the tallow trade in the city of London. I've shown my gratitude to Sedley, and he's tried it of late, sir, as my cheque-book can show. George, I tell you in confidence I don't like the looks of Mr. Sedley's affairs. My chief clerk, Mr. Copper, does not like the looks of him, and he's an old file and knows change as well as any man in London. Holker and Bullock are looking shy at him. He's been dabbling on his own account, I fear. They say the jeune Amelia was his, which was taken by the Yankee privateer Molasses. And that's my flat. Unless I see Amelia's 10,000 down, you don't marry her. I'll have no lame duck's daughter in my family. Pass the wine, sir, or ring for coffee. With which Mr. Osborne spread out the evening paper, and George knew from this signal that the colloquy was ended, and that his papa was about to take a nap. He hurried upstairs to Amelia in the highest spirits. What was it that made him more attentive to her on that night than he had been for a long time, more eager to amuse her, more tender, more brilliant in talk? Was it that his generous heart warmed her at the prospect of misfortune, or that the idea of losing the dear little prize made him value it more? She lived upon the recollections of that happy evening for many days afterwards, remembering his words, his looks, the song he sang, his attitude as he leant over her or looked at her from a distance. As it seemed to her, no night ever passed so quickly in Mr. Osborne's house before, and for once this young person was almost provoked to be angry by the premature arrival of Mr. Sambo with her shawl. George came and took a tender leave of her the next morning, and then hurried off to the city, where he visited Mr. Chopper, and received from that gentleman a document which he exchanged to Holker and Bullock's for a whole pocketful of money. As George entered the house, old John Sedley was passing out of the banker's parlour, looking very dismal, but his godson was much too elated to mark the worthy stockbroker's depression, or the dreary eyes which the kind old gentleman cast upon him. Young Bullock did not come grinning out of the parlour with him, as had been his wont in former years. And as the swinging doors of Holker, Bullock, and Co. closed upon Mr. Sedley, Mr. Quill, the cashier, whose benevolent occupation it is to hand out crisp banknotes from a drawer and dispense sovereigns out of a copper shovel, winked at Mr. Driver, the clerk at the desk on his right. Mr. Driver winked again. "No go," Mr. D. whispered. "Not at no price," Mr. Q. said. "Mr. George Osborne, sir. How will you take it?" George crammed eagerly a quantity of notes into his pockets, paid Dodman £50 that very evening at mess. That very evening Amelia wrote him the tenderest of long letters. Her heart was overflowing with tenderness, but it still foreboded evil. What was the cause of Mr. Osborne's dark looks? She asked. Had any difference arisen between him and her papa? Her poor papa returned so melancholy from the city that all were alarmed about him at home. In fine, there were 4 pages of loves and fears and hopes and forebodings. "Poor little Emmy, dear little Emmy, how fond she is of me," George said as he perused the missive, "and gad, what a headache that mixed punch has given me." Poor little Emmy, indeed. End of